escucha así? Sí. El profesor John Harris, a quien ustedes conocieron el día de ayer, que ha recibido el título de Lord, así es que Lord John Harris, es un gran bioeticista, coeditor en jefe del Journal of Medical Ethics, director del Instituto de Ciencia, Ética e Innovación en la Universidad de Manchester, autor de múltiples publicaciones, como son los libros Clones, Genes e Inmortalidad, Mejorando la Evolución, sobre clonación y muchos otros. No quiero redundar más en su presentación, pero realmente es un honor tenerlo, profesor Harris, con nosotros. Y está también con nosotros el doctor Francisco Pellicer. Él es investigador responsable en el Laboratorio de Neurofisiología Integrativa del Instituto Nacional de Psiquiatría Juan Ramón de la Fuente. Es investigador que ha publicado...
Ramón de la Fuente. Juan. Uno es el papá y otro es el hijo.
Ramón de la Fuente. Ha publicado numerosos trabajos de investigación sobre fisiología del dolor y sobre neuroética. Es miembro del programa universitario de bioética de la UNAM y también le agradecemos mucho su presencia el día de hoy. La doctora Juliana González es doctora en filosofía de la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México. Todos ustedes la conocen bien. Profesora emérita de la Facultad de Filosofía y Letras, investigadora emérita del Sistema Nacional de Investigadores, miembro titular del Institute International de Filosofía. Es autora de 22 libros, entre ellos Ética y Libertad, El malestar de la moral, El poder del eros, Genoma humano y dignidad humana, y muchos más. Ha participado como consejera de la Comisión Nacional de los Derechos Humanos, en la Comisión Nacional de Bioética, la Comisión Nacional de Arbitraje Médico del Consejo Consultivo de Ciencias de la Presidencia de la República, y también fue presidenta de la Asociación Filosófica de México. Ella ha sido distinguida con el Premio Nacional de Ciencias y Artes del área de filosofía. Es doctora honoris causa de la UNAM, Premio Universidad Nacional de la Investigación en Humanidades, entre otras distinciones. Así es que esta mesa está compuesta por distinguidos ponentes sobresalientes en el ámbito de la cultura, de la ética, con una gran influencia en la sociedad. Y los temas de ellos son el Lord John Harris, How to be Good, el doctor Francisco Pellicer, De la nave de los locos a los fármacos de la razón, y la doctora Juliana González, Ética y Neuroética. Así es que le doy la palabra al profesor Harris.
Form of cognitive enhancement, namely education. It is incredibly addictive. Some of us spend our lives and sacrifice much greater remuneration in other professions to be academics. So I think we have to put, as it were, the possible addictive nature of cognitive enhancing drugs in some sort of context. However, that is not my topic for this morning. How to be good? What could be a more important question? This is a fragment of a book I'm hoping to finish before Christmas on the same title, How to be Good, which will be published by Oxford University Press. So this is a tiny 20-minute fragment of some of the arguments, thank you, in that book. If someone says, I'm good, thank you, usually in response to a polite inquiry, how are you? I'm good, thank you. We take that as sort of unproblematic, but it always inspires me to think, or sometimes to say, if I hear somebody say, I'm good, thank you, to say, that is a very interesting hypothesis. How are we going to test that hypothesis? The hypothesis that someone is good. And what I want to say this morning is a little bit in answer to that question. So what I want to say is about testing that hypothesis. Now, of course, we could try to test it by asking the individual making the claim, if somebody was so vain as to make the claim that they were good, what he or she had done that was so good. We might want to have a sort of list of their good deeds. Maybe more sophisticatedly, we might want to know how they knew that what they had done was good. And of course, the person interrogated might just claim to be existentially good, good in herself, perhaps because she was full of good intentions, although she never carried them out, replete with virtues, although they were never practiced, and so on. The list of good things she might have done, I believe, would be relatively uncontroversial. There is a significant consensus among human beings about good and bad, and that is a very comforting thought. We know what's good. I could list 100 things that might happen to you today, and I'm sure you could all unerringly rank order them in for how good they will be for you or how bad they will be for you. We pretty much know what's good for us, and we pretty much know what's bad for us. So lists are partly a testament to the objectivity of ethics. We know what's good. We don't want to die prematurely, we don't want to suffer, we don't want our children to be killed before us. It's a whole range of things. We know what's good and we know what's bad. However, just as good reasons must of force give place to better, so likewise good deeds, even a good deed, might displace a better that might have been done. So even things that might seem good in themselves may on reflection not be the right thing to do because you might have done something better. So even doing something unproblematically good, ameliorating pain and suffering and so on, but you might have ameliorated more, you might have done better. So it pays to be reflective about morality. In order to be as confident as we can of the moral success of our actions, we need to know, or rather believe, more than that these actions are well motivated, done for with good intentions in mind, or that they express pro-social attitudes or human sympathy. We need to know that what we do is best, all things considered. Now, part of the reason for presenting as many of the arguments as I can get into the next 15 minutes to you this morning is because there is quite a large literature growing now on so-called moral enhancement, and particularly on shortcuts to moral enhancements of the chemical and molecular form that we partly heard about from Ricardo just a few minutes ago. And much of the literature concentrates on whether drugs like serotonin or molecules like oxytocin, which improve pro-sociality and diminish violence, constitute moral enhancements. Now, I don't think they do. And in the rest of what I want to say, I want to explain, not because being less violent and more pro-social is not a good thing, but because it's not a moral thing. And I'll try and explain now what I mean by that. I've argued in many places over the years that someone who cares about doing the right thing, the morally right thing, for whom the difference between right and wrong is important, will always want to ask herself this question: is what feels right actually right? They will want to assure themselves that insofar as it's in their power, they really are acting well, or even better than acting well, acting for the best, all things considered. They want to know if what seems right is right. They will, in short, be interested in a crucial distinction completely unemphasized in the literature on moral enhancement, but a distinction emphasized by no less a reflective thinking being than Shakespeare's Hamlet in his riposte to his mother. "Seems, madam? Nay, it is. I know not seems." We want to know the difference between what seems good and what is good. The difference between what seems and what is in ethics can only be delivered by reasoning. That is my claim, that is my hypothesis, if not thesis. Nothing that today can pass for morality or can count as a moral principle can be isolated from reason and reflection. Moreover, no one who claims to be acting morally, or out of moral conviction, or out of moral principle, can resist accountability for what they claim to believe or do in the name of morality. And this means they must always be prepared to offer reasons and justifications for what they do. It would never be enough, or indeed even respectable, if somebody was asked, why is that the right thing to do? Why was that right? Oh, I just felt it was. I just felt like doing it. That's not enough. Ronald Dworkin elaborated this requirement for a detailed theory-based justification for moral claims in a way that requires no further gloss. And I won't go into that here, but I can give you the reference to it later. It's in Taking Right Seriously, his first book. But even deeds acknowledged to be good, deeds that might seem good in themselves, might not be good, as I've said, all things considered. It would always be necessary for moral impulses to be subjected to reason and reflection. A moral agent will always want to consider all things, or at least, as the phrase implicitly implies, all things that can be considered in the time available for a decision, which may not be many in certain emergency situations. There is an important distinction that I want to emphasize here, and that is the distinction between doing good and acting morally. You might think doing good is enough, but it's not. There is a distinction between doing good and acting morally, between judgments about things that are ethically consistent, that are ethically significant and ethically judgment. So everybody agrees that abortion in human beings is an ethically important issue. But to have a view about the rights and wrongs of abortion is not eo ipso necessarily to have a moral view. It has to meet certain tests. Because we can have prejudices about abortion as well, and morality and prejudice are distinct sorts of a thing. So it is commonly believed that if you have a view or a position or a belief about a moral issue, that's a moral view, position, or belief. Not necessarily. You better work harder than that. And so partly what I'm trying to do today is say a bit more about what that harder work involves. To be an ethical judgment, rather than simply a judgment about something of ethical importance, that judgment first has actually to be a judgment. It has to involve the exercise of judgment. It's not simply a pronouncement. A judgment, moreover, is a conclusion arrived at by a deliberative process, a process that involves the exercise of judgment, to weigh things up. To count as a moral judgment, that deliberative process, of which it is a part, has to weigh alternatives from some justifiably moral perspective. For example, it has to consider alternatives from the perspective of the amount and quality of the good that might thereby be achieved, or the rights that might thereby be protected, or the justice that might thereby be achieved, and so on, or the harm or suffering that might be mitigated or avoided, or by the number of lives lost and saved, and so on. These are all parts of what it kind of is to come to a moral judgment about something, rather than merely a moral opinion or a moral pronouncement about something. And just as moral judgment is more than a statement that has some moral relevance, an argument is more than a series of contradictory statements. I don't know whether I dare go into this with this audience. Do any of you know of Monty Python? It is a sort of British institution. Some of you do. There's a wonderful sketch, it's a comedy sketch which involves some well-known comedians, John Cleese and others. And there is a wonderful sketch in one of the Monty Python shows. A man is walking along the street and he sees a sign up above a shop. It says, "Arguments, £10." So he thinks, that's great, I love a good argument. And I'm very sympathetic with that, because I love a good argument. So he goes in, pays his £10 to the man, and they start an argument. I'm just going to read you a fragment of the dialogue. You can find this on YouTube, and it's great fun. Man, he's beginning to get dissatisfied with the argument. The quality of the argument he was having. I came here for a good argument. Argument? Oh, no, you didn't. You came here for an argument. Well, an argument isn't just contradiction. Well, it can be. No, it can't. An argument is a connected series of statements intended to establish a proposition. No, it isn't. Yes, it is. It isn't just contradiction. Look, if I argue with you, I must take up a contrary position. Yes, but it isn't just saying, no, it isn't. Yes, it is. No, it isn't. And they go on like that. Now, that illustrates, in a rather humorous way, I think, the fact that there is a difference between argument and contradiction. And there is a difference between a moral judgment and other forms of statements about morality. And we are too often subjected in ethics to people's prejudices dressed up as moral judgments. They think that they're moral judgments just because they're about something moral, but they're not. You've got to qualify to make a moral judgment. And that qualification involves in the willingness and the ability to provide a reasoned defense of it. And that's our business as ethicists. It is the reasoned defense of behavior, of actions, and so on. So I hope it's clear that not all behavior, and not even all behavior that affects moral outcomes, is moral behavior, any more than all behavior that affects political outcomes is political behavior. At the time I wrote these remarks a couple of years ago, there had been a huge amount of rioting and looting in London. I happened to be in Italy at the time, and I was looking at the pictures on television, and I just didn't believe what I saw happening in a city I lived in some of the time. That clearly was behavior with a profound moral and political consequence. But to call it moral and political behavior would require the telling of a rather different story. Now, I'm not suggesting that that story might not, in some sorts of circumstances, be tellable. Sometimes people do want to express political judgments by direct action, and there's quite a literature on this. But they aren't just simply political actions because they're of political importance. They have to qualify in certain ways. There is also a long-standing distinction in moral philosophy between judging persons and judging actions. This is necessary, but not least because good people can do bad things and bad people can do good things. So we want to distinguish between what is relevant to the assessment of a person, of a character as good, and what is necessary for the assessment of what they do or what they think as being good. They're not necessarily the same thing. Thus, we need a moral sensibility capable of evaluating both the goodness of actions and their effects, and the goodness of people, and what makes for that goodness. If we are interested in the individual biography of someone, we'll be interested in whether they're a good person. But very often for political purposes, and indeed for regulatory purposes, we're not interested in moral character at all. What we want is to regulate what they do and make sure it reaches certain sorts of moral standards. Final point, if I can get to it. You can do good by accident, unintentionally, but you can't be moral unintentionally. Well, I think there's an analogy with science here. You can't do science accidentally. You might discover something of scientific importance accidentally, but that's not doing science. Doing science is a disciplined activity. It requires the formulation and testing of hypotheses and a whole range of other things which many members of this audience will be much more clear about than I am. But I want to claim that just as you can't do science by accident, you can't be moral by accident. You may do good by accident, but you can't be moral. So, insofar as there are drugs or molecules that purportedly affect moral behavior, that may be correct, but they do not actually affect moral behavior at all. They affect behavior, and we draw conclusions that it was better that they behaved like that than in some other way. In another paper, I've argued that the idea of using molecules like serotonin and oxytocin to regulate behavior, while not necessarily morally problematic in itself, is not a method of moral enhancement, partly because it has a bad effect on freedom. This is the last point I want to make. There's a lovely remark by the Renaissance English poet John Milton in his Paradise Lost. Very famous remark, re-quoted by many authors. He imagines I haven't brought the exact quote with me, but I think I'll remember it. He imagines a conversation between God and man. And God is saying, I made you something like just and right, sufficient, and this is the quote I'm interested, sufficient to have stood, but free to fall. In other words, I gave you moral choice. And it is the essence of moral choice that you have the capacity to either stand or fall as a result of your own reflective judgment. I am very suspicious of trying to control behavior in a way that might diminish our freedom to fall. I think that is an essential part of the virtue of not falling. And morality and virtue are intimately connected. So I'm not against manipulating people, particularly very bad people who would otherwise have to lock up with drugs and molecules and so on. And there is a degree of changes that we can make that don't affect freedom. A counter-argument that is often put to me is, look, women are much less aggressive than men, but they're not less free than men. So if we were to feminize men universally, we wouldn't necessarily diminish freedom, but we might improve the moral quality of the universe. Now, actually, I'm quite sympathetic to that view, and in my second book, which is called The Value of Life, which very few people read now, it's still around, I actually imagine an all-female world and could find no objection to deliberately producing such a world, so long as you didn't do it by killing any existing men. The scenario was that, this was in the time of very militant feminism, and I imagined a scenario of militant feminists who got together and said, look, we don't, the world would be much better if it was just females. And of course, technology had solved the problems as it has of females reproducing without the assistance of men. We can make, subject to another talk I gave in the city a couple of days ago, we can make synthetic gametes. So you imagine that's been completed. The current generation of women just make this bargain. We will go on treating all the existing men as we have before. If we're married to them, we'll continue to relate to them, we'll continue to sleep with them. What we won't do is breed with them. And we'll only breed women. We'll just allow the present generation of men to die out. And then we'll be left with all of these much gentler, less aggressive, less violent creatures, and the world will be better. I have some sympathy with that view. I have some sympathy with that view. I sort of hope in my heart of hearts that it won't attract too many women. But maybe I'm irrational to think that. So I'm not against the changing of people's dispositions to a certain degree, so long as we can do so in a way that does two things. Firstly, allows them still to make decisions on their own, free to fall, and still makes them sensitive to the fact that it is not sufficient to do good things in order to be moral. You have to have a view about what it is to be moral. Now, I've said nothing about a complete picture of that view. That's a job for another occasion. Thank you very much. Oh, microphone, sorry. Look, I know I'm trying to hog the argument, but even for me, this is a bit excessive. I apologize.
Bueno, en primera instancia quiero agradecer de verdad el honor de la invitación al doctor Tapia y poderles platicar un poquito lo que pensamos al respecto de uno de los puntos que él ya trató al principio, de un panorama extraordinario de lo que desde el punto de vista de las neurociencias pensamos que tiene que ser la bioética. Por suerte, cuando empezó a hablar de adicciones y empezó a hablar de algunas de estas cosas, ya no dije tanto, entonces dije, bueno, algo voy a poder decirles a ustedes. Entonces, y por otra razón, normalmente los neurocientíficos agarramos los PowerPoints y agarramos las gráficas que hacemos en el laboratorio, pero últimamente, gracias a mi gran afecto por los filósofos, me ha dado por leer. Entonces, si me perdonan, voy a leer el texto.
Ni una diapositiva.
Una. Este es el minimalismo sintético. Desde tiempos inmemoriales, el hombre ha utilizado sustancias que inciden en su estado de ánimo, alterándolo de forma deliberada sus niveles de conciencia. Si bien el uso de estas sustancias ha tenido diversas justificaciones personales y sociales que van desde la búsqueda de la novedad hasta las relacionadas con rituales mágicos y religiosos, el punto de partida de su utilización es por el placer que produce. Esto implica que existe en el cerebro sitios que están relacionados con cuya actividad produce el placer. Epicuro en el cerebro. Estos sitios funcionales de lo que denominaré como el hedonismo cerebral están constituidos por redes complejas de neuronas y neurotransmisores razonablemente definidas, sino bien totalmente estudiadas. ¿Por qué me refiero a sitios funcionales? Esta es una pequeña diferencia que va un poquito más allá de lo que ya Ricardo puso. Voy ya un poco más allá de la sinapsis y de la relación que hay entre los neurotransmisores y la sinapsis como parte anatómica, sino algo ya un poco más global. En realidad, no son sitios definidos anatómicamente en el cerebro, sino en su arreglo que produce una función. Y la función tiene asociados varios constructos fisiológicos como los procesos de memoria, retribución, aprendizaje, y uno particularmente complejo que comprende en cierta forma a los antes mencionados y que están relacionados con las emociones y los afectos. Uno de los principales sitios funcionales relacionados con los elementos que nos llevan a realizar acciones o conductas para la obtención de una recompensa o retribución es el sistema mesolímbico dopaminérgico. Dicho sistema está constituido por un grupo de neuronas productoras de dopamina que se origina en el área tegmental ventral, también denominada A10. Este sitio se encuentra en el cerebro medio y envía proyecciones hacia la parte frontal del cerebro mediante un camino, el haz medial del cerebro anterior, una de las estructuras donde hace blanco este camino, esta vía, es el núcleo accumbens. El núcleo accumbens es otro ejemplo de una estructura funcional, ya que en él se integran de forma primordial la retribución y el reforzamiento, que después se transformarán en conductas de búsqueda o evitación, cuando se asocian a otras estructuras funcionales que van agregando no solamente la calidad sensorial o qualia, sino la complejidad en el nivel cognoscitivo. Hasta ahora se ha esbozado una estructura funcional que es la base de conductas que se encuentran en la norma de todo ser humano. A continuación plantearé un eje en cuyos centros se encuentran los mecanismos antes citados. En un extremo, la avidez irrefrenable por las conductas de recompensa ligadas al placer, la cual se denomina adicción, y en el otro, una patología psiquiátrica en la cual se encuentran implicadas las mismas estructuras funcionales y que se denomina esquizofrenia. Formato de un continuo conductual en el cual un gran conjunto de conductas comparten un factor común, un neurotransmisor llamado dopamina. Visita al territorio de la adicción. Para considerarnos adictos a algo, se tiene que cumplir con varias condiciones: tolerancia, dependencia, abstinencia y el deterioro de la homeostasis entre las tres esferas de interacción que constituyen al ser humano: la biológica, la psicológica y la social. Una explicación para que el hecho de que sustancias tan diferentes en estructuras desde el punto de vista farmacológico se conviertan en drogas de abuso con una fuerte capacidad adictiva está en que actúan sobre la misma estructura funcional ligada a la recompensa y a la recompensa placentera. ¿Cómo es que la cocaína, que es en parte un estimulante cardíaco, y por otro lado la heroína, con potentes cualidades analgésicas y sedantes, sustancias disímiles desde el punto de vista farmacológico, producen formas de adicción análogas? Buena parte de la respuesta radica en que estas sustancias determinan que el núcleo accumbens reciba de manera brutal una mareada, una oleada de dopamina, y cuando esta acción se repite de forma sucesiva o en cantidades mayores a los rangos fisiológicos, el sistema experimenta cambios tanto en las células productoras de este neurotransmisor como en aquellas que tienen los receptores a dopamina en las neuronas del núcleo accumbens, la parte posterior de la cadena. Estos cambios plásticos y adaptativos se traducen en que los individuos necesitan dosis cada vez mayores de una droga para experimentar el mismo efecto hedónico. A esto es lo que se denomina tolerancia. La dependencia es un proceso de mayor complejidad, que involucra el asociar los efectos hedónicos con situaciones, personas, afectos, es decir, con el entorno del consumo. Finalmente, los cambios producidos en la maquinaria molecular íntima de las neuronas son la base para la cadena de cambios sucesivos que culminan con alteraciones en la esfera social del individuo adicto. Ello hace que la suspensión súbita de la droga produzca cambios sistemáticos, generalizados en este nuevo equilibrio, lo que se conoce como abstinencia. La abstinencia es en realidad un sistema de alarma fisiológico muy desagradable que alerta al individuo a reponer al cuerpo las sustancias que hacen falta en este nuevo arreglo homeostático. El anillo de las emociones, cómplice de las adicciones. El sistema límbico juega un papel determinante en la generación de emociones. De hecho, se constituye per se en el cerebro emocional. Yo agregaría que en el cerebro primario, y como primario me refiero a fundamental, este cerebro de cocodrilo que tenemos dentro de nosotros, el cual implica que existe un proceso ulterior de las emociones, o más aún, emociones generadas desde lo que llamamos la esfera de la racionalidad. Es en esta última implicación que se puede fundamentar el consumo de sustancias que parecieran no ser adictivas, que podrían no actuar de primera instancia en centros hedónicos. Estas sustancias producen una gran exaltación de las esferas afectivas y emocionales, las cuales, a su vez, están más relacionadas con los procesos de conciencia. En realidad, este otro tipo de adicción se relaciona más con el afecto y con las emociones generadoras de placer en una segunda instancia, y no nada más con las placenteras per se o con las que en común denominador los individuos consideran, o lo que el común denominador los individuos consideran grato, sino con las que de manera personal, cultural y cognitiva el individuo considera necesarias, interesantes y por ende placenteras. En el otro extremo del eje se enferman las emociones y la realidad. En el otro lado se encuentra una entidad de la patología psiquiátrica compleja denominada, que se denominó en un inicio por Kraepelin en 1887, demencia precoz. El término esquizofrenia se deriva de las palabras griegas esquizo, dividido, escindido, y frenos, mente, y fue acuñado posteriormente por Eugene Bleuler para referirse a la falta de integración entre los procesos cognitivos y las percepciones. Brevemente, la enfermedad por lo general inicia en la adolescencia o en los adultos jóvenes, perdura toda la vida. Los pacientes presentan alucinaciones auditivas, usualmente escuchan voces que conversan con el enfermo y le dan órdenes. Presenta delusiones, que quiere decir pensamiento paranoide, es decir, la creencia de que fuerzas externas conspiran contra él y quieren controlar. Y para los pacientes representa un gran conflicto el reconocer la realidad o la veracidad de esas voces, así como las actitudes atribuidas a los demás. También manifiestan problemas de atención, aplanamiento afectivo, anedonia, disfunción cognitiva. Todo lo anterior produce lo que se denomina una dishabilidad social, una dishabilidad para la navegación social. Una de las hipótesis de la fisiopatogenia de la enfermedad es la relacionada con el aumento de la actividad dopaminérgica en la corteza prefrontal. Esto se sustenta en el hecho de que los agonistas de la dopamina, estas sustancias que hacen lo mismo que la dopamina y que ocupan sus receptores, inducen o incrementan un cuadro psicótico muy parecido al que se experimenta en los pacientes esquizofrénicos. Por otro lado, el bloqueo de estos receptores mejora o revierte el cuadro. De forma paradójica, estos sujetos presentan anedonia, a pesar de tener un incrementado tono dopaminérgico. Un episodio psicótico agudo en un paciente con esquizofrenia se precipita por la convergencia de varios procesos patológicos que inducen un aumento en la neurotransmisión dopaminérgica. Por lo tanto, el tratamiento farmacológico se centrará en el control justamente de esta neurotransmisión. El primer antipsicótico neuroléptico utilizado para el tratamiento de esquizofrenia fue la cloropromacina, posteriormente el haloperidol con mayor potencia. Ambos son bloqueadores del receptor D2, de un subreceptor en particular de la dopamina. Y hoy en día contamos con antipsicóticos de tercera generación, además de los denominados nuevos, de segunda generación o atípicos. Si bien no pretendo ahondar en la farmacología ni en el tratamiento de esto, lo importante es que estos fármacos restablecen en buena medida la relación con la realidad, mejoran el aplanamiento afectivo, revierten la anedonia y sacan al paciente del episodio psicótico agudo. He elegido los ejemplos anteriores con el fin de explicar el hecho de que un mismo sistema fisiológico puede participar en una serie de funciones que generan conductas con un amplio rango de complejidad, pero que dentro de ciertos parámetros se constituyen en parámetros normales de la vida del individuo. En parte, el problema radica en establecer los linderos de la norma. Esa tarea corresponde al individuo, a los núcleos cercanos al individuo, a la familia, al clan, a la sociedad en la que se encuentran inmersos. Implica, pues, cultura y temporalidad. Hace algunas décadas no existía un arsenal farmacológico, décadas, para poder contender de manera racional con la enfermedad mental en general. Los enfermos mentales han sido tratados de diversas formas por la sociedad, muchas de las cuales hoy diríamos que no cumplen con los mínimos umbrales éticos. Cito brevemente